Angela Mueller was born in Hamburg, a city of steel and water, raised in the sterile greenhouse of academia and rigid regulation. Her father, a civil engineer, saw the world as a series of load-bearing structures and stress points. Her mother, a sociology professor, viewed society as a collection of datasets to be categorized and analyzed. From her earliest memories, Angela was taught that order and safety were two sides of the same meticulously minted coin. Her world was one of precise lines and predictable outcomes. She excelled naturally, graduating to the Hamburg Institute for Environmental Studies, a place where every debate was settled by data charts and mathematical models. For Angela, the world wasn't a mystery to be experienced, but a system to be measured, predicted, and ultimately controlled. Her doctoral thesis, The Secure City in the Data Age, was lauded in Western journals as a landmark in urban studies. During a lecture in a sleek, minimalist hall in Berlin, she declared with unshakable confidence, "Only through smart surveillance, artificial intelligence, and big data can we guarantee the safety of our citizens." Each word was a hammer blow, a scientist's testament to the unassailable power of reason and logic, echoing through the rapt auditorium. But then, a single question from the audience made her falter. An elderly professor, his eyes crinkling behind thick glasses, rose slowly and asked, "If that is true, Dr. Mueller, then how do you explain Savannah, Georgia? A city of bewildering pedestrian layouts, almost no centralized surveillance, where people move at a pace dictated by the heat. Not a clock. How can its crime rate be consistently lower than many of Europe's most monitored cities?" A hush fell over the hall. For the first time in her professional life, Angela had no immediate answer. She offered a tight, professional smile to mask her surprise, but deep inside, a hairline crack had appeared in the formidable fortress of her theories. That night, in her book-lined office, bathed in the tired, yellow light of a desk lamp, Angela opened her laptop and began to search for Savannah. The more she read, the more baffled she became. The city seemed to be a living contradiction to every Western model she had mastered. It lacked a dense network of CCTV cameras. Its historic homes were often protected by nothing more than a wrought iron gate and a sense of neighborly watchfulness. Yet, its violent crime statistics were staggeringly low for a city of its size and diversity. In her notebook, she scribbled a question that felt like heresy. Are there factors that Western models cannot define? A few weeks later, she applied for a short-term research grant to travel to the United States. In the official proposal, she stated her purpose clearly: to explore the socio-behavioral and community factors influencing urban safety in Savannah, Georgia. But in her heart, it was more than an exploration. It was a mission to prove that her data, her theories, were still correct. To prove that the perceived safety of the Savannahians was a statistical anomaly, a fleeting accident of culture that would eventually succumb to the universal laws of chaos she so deeply believed in. The pride of a German scholar would not allow her to concede that something could exist beyond the grasp of her established framework. The day the grant approval letter arrived, Angela sat by her window, watching the autumn leaves tremble in the Hamburg wind. The sky was a heavy, unforgiving gray, but her mind had already drifted to a city of Spanish moss, humid air, and the distant aroma of slow-cooked barbecue. She pictured herself navigating its cobblestone squares, digital recorder in hand, gathering the evidence that would prove, once and for all, that only systems of control could create true safety. But in her confident gaze, a faint glimmer of doubt flickered. A light so small she had not yet realized it would lead her away from everything she had ever believed. The plane descended through a thick blanket of humid, late-night air, landing gently at the Savannah/Hilton Head International Airport. Through the thick, cool glass of the window, Angela Mueller watched the ribbons of headlights on the highway below, flowing like molten gold in the darkness. The moment the cabin door opened, a wave of warm, damp air, fragrant with the scent of blooming magnolias and distant marshland, washed over her. It was a sensory shock, a sudden awakening of the skin and lungs that made her feel, for a moment, wonderfully and terrifyingly alive. The airport was a low hum of activity. The gentle twang of Southern accents in the announcements, the joyful chatter of reuniting families, the smooth glide of suitcase wheels across polished floors, and the cheerful calls of the cab drivers just outside. Savannah was unlike any city she had ever visited. It felt disorganized yet vibrant, noisy yet imbued with an undercurrent of warmth that held no trace of menace. Angela hailed an old, slightly worn sedan, settling into the back seat as her driver, a middle-aged man with a kind, weathered face and a slow, comforting drawl, turned to her. "Evenin', ma'am. Welcome to Savannah. Where you fixin' to go tonight?" he asked, his smile genuine. He spent the entire ride pointing out local landmarks, not with the rehearsed patter of a tour guide, but with the quiet pride of a lifelong resident. He gestured toward the glow of a historic church steeple, its bells silent for the night. "That old church has been standin' there since before the war. The big one, I mean. The one between the states." In her notebook, Angela wrote, "No clear traffic hierarchy, yet an invisible system of mutual accommodation seems to prevail." As the cab stopped at a red light, she watched a group of college students pause their conversation to help an elderly woman with her groceries cross the street. The driver tipped his head toward them in a gesture of silent approval. That simple, uncoerced act of kindness struck her with more force than any urban theory she had ever studied. The first night, she stepped out of her small hotel in the historic district to explore. The air was thick and syrupy. Along the cobblestone street, several small diners and cafes were still open, their warm lights spilling onto the sidewalk. The owners, standing in their doorways, offered warm smiles and friendly nods, inviting her to try a slice of pecan pie or a glass of sweet tea. Even as a stranger, a woman alone, she didn't feel the probing, suspicious stares she had grown accustomed to in certain European cities. On a corner in one of the city's famous squares, a small group of young musicians played a soulful blues tune on an acoustic guitar and a harmonica. A few children sat on the edge of a fountain, listening, their laughter as clear and bright as the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Angela paused, recording the music on her phone, and added a note to her journal. High degree of perceived safety. Cause. Friendly and open community atmosphere. Back in her room, she opened her laptop to organize her preliminary observations. The screen glowed with her typed words. No visible police presence, no public CCTV systems, no palpable sense of fear. She frowned, rubbing her temples. Everything was the inverse of her predictions. According to her theories, a lack of overt regulation should heighten public vigilance and suspicion. But here, the opposite was true. The sense of security seemed to spring not from being watched, but from the quiet confidence of not being watched at all. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it is because I am a foreigner, a tourist, that they're so polite. But deep down, Angela felt something more fundamental was at play. Savannah operated by a set of invisible rules, a social contract that her Western models had never accounted for. As the night deepened, she stood on the small wrought iron balcony of her room, looking down at the street, still aglow with the soft, yellow light of gas lamps. Bicycles glided past in near silence, a diner owner hosed down his sidewalk for the next day, and a couple walked hand in hand, their laughter echoing softly in the humid air. She watched as a young woman stopped to help a man who had had too much to drink, gently guiding him to a bench and leaving a bottle of water beside him. There was no shouting, no police intervention, just a simple, instinctive act of help between strangers. A tightness formed in Angela's chest, a confusing blend of being deeply moved and profoundly perplexed. She was beginning to suspect that perhaps safety wasn't born from the fear of punishment, but from the promise of trust. As the clock neared midnight, she closed her laptop, turned off the lights, and listened to the sounds of the city. It wasn't the roar of a metropolis, it was a gentle, living pulse. And in that symphony of soft sounds, she felt not a single thread of anxiety. For the first time in years, Angela Mueller realized she was completely alone in a foreign place, yet she had never felt safer. Savannah was speaking to her in a language that no number or dataset could ever capture, the language of the human heart. The first 3 nights in Savannah were a cascade of experiences that left Angela both exhilarated and deeply unsettled. By day, she meticulously documented the city's structural data, the width of its sidewalks, the density of its bicycle racks, the frequency of its traffic signals. But it was at night, when the gas lamps cast long shadows and a different, more fluid rhythm of life took over, that she discovered her data was utterly incapable of explaining the feeling in her gut. From the balcony of her hotel room, she would gaze down into the narrow lanes and open squares, illuminated by the warm glow of neon signs from tucked-away bars and the soft lights from restaurant windows. The night was a tapestry of sounds, the murmur of conversations drifting from outdoor patios, the sizzle of shrimp and grits in a nearby kitchen, the rustle of palmetto leaves in the breeze. It was a concert without a conductor, a living, breathing thing. And yet, amidst it all, she felt no fear, even though she was a woman alone, an outsider in a city she did not know. To gather what she still stubbornly called authentic data, Angela decided to conduct a series of personal explorations. Armed with her digital recorder, a GPS-enabled phone, and a small, leather-bound notebook, she set out. On the first night, she chose River Street, a bustling, chaotic ribbon of cobblestone and old cotton warehouses repurposed into bars, restaurants, and souvenir shops. It was Savannah's answer to a tourist hub, a place where order should, by her logic, break down. She methodically recorded behaviors: tourists, slightly tipsy from local craft beer, boisterous groups of friends laughing loudly, crowds jostling for space on the narrow walkway. At one point, a minor dispute broke out between 2 street vendors over a patch of pavement. Angela held her breath, expecting an escalation. But after a brief exchange, one man simply shrugged, said, "Pardon me, brother," and moved his cart a few feet over. The tension dissolved as quickly as it had formed. She quickly jotted down, "Conflict de-escalated without external intervention." High social self-regulation. The phrase made her pause. In Europe, such a scenario would likely have ended in shouting, perhaps even a call to the police. Here, it was resolved with deference and a shared desire to keep the peace. The second night, she ventured into the city market, a 4-block area of open-air courtyards filled with art galleries and live music. Even late into the evening, when most European cities would have shuttered their windows and sent their citizens home, the streets of Savannah were alive with laughter. A group of young locals on cruiser bicycles, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones, approached the intersection she was about to cross. Instead of racing past, they slowed to a stop, and one of them waved her on. "You go ahead, ma'am," he called out with a smile. The simple gesture froze her in place. She had braced herself for the possibility of a catcall or a dismissive glance, the kind of casual incivility she had encountered in other cities. But there was nothing. Just a simple act of courtesy, offered as if it were the most natural thing in the world. On the third night, she found herself in a small, family-run diner near the tranquil expanse of Forsyth Park. The owner, a woman in her 60s with warm, knowing eyes and a gentle southern accent, was wiping down the counter. Angela, feeling a surge of courage, asked her why she thought people in Savannah were so friendly, so trusting. The woman, Martha, simply chuckled. "Well, honey, around here, if someone's had a little too much to drink, we don't just walk on by. Someone's gonna make sure they get home safe. We don't let folks sleep it off on the sidewalk." That simple sentence, "We don't let folks sleep it off on the sidewalk," reverberated in Angela's mind. It wasn't a law, it was an ethos. Perhaps, she thought, this sense of mutual care was the very thing that replaced the systems of control her world so fervently believed in. Back in her room, she looked over her notebook, filled with her precise, scientific handwriting interspersed with chaotic, emotional scribbles. The numbers no longer made sense. They couldn't capture the power of a shared glance, a polite gesture, a quiet act of kindness. Angela's long-held convictions were beginning to crumble. She tried to find flaws in her observations, to prove that what she was seeing was merely a polished facade. But she couldn't. Savannah seemed to operate on a principle her models had never heard of, the principle of common decency. Before falling asleep, she wrote a single, fragmented sentence. Not fear, but trust. And Angela Mueller, the woman who had built a career on the unshakable bedrock of scientific certainty, began, for the first time, to question the axioms she had once held as truth. On her fourth night, Angela Mueller decided to do something her colleagues in Hamburg would have deemed reckless, an unacceptable risk. At midnight, she would walk alone through a sparsely populated residential area. She wanted to know what insecurity felt like in the absence of surveillance. If there are no cameras here, no police patrols, will I be safe? She asked herself, standing on the edge of Monterey Square, one of the city's more remote and atmospheric public spaces. The gas lamps cast a dim, golden glow, and the humid night air, thick with the scent of jasmine and car exhaust, brushed against her skin. She carried only a small shoulder bag containing her phone, her recorder, and her notebook. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the shadows beneath the massive, moss-draped live oaks, her heart beginning to pound a little faster. The distant sounds of city traffic faded away, replaced by the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog from a nearby courtyard. She quickened her pace, fighting to control a rising tide of fear. Images from European news reports, stories of nighttime assaults, muggings in dark parks, flashed through her mind. Her survival instincts, honed by years of urban risk assessment, were on full alert. Suddenly, 3 young men emerged from across the street, walking directly toward her. They looked like they had just left a bar, their conversation loud and punctuated with laughter. Angela's body went rigid. A primal fear, cold and sharp, shot through her. She clutched her bag tighter, every cell in her body screaming a warning. All her research into criminal behavior told her this was a classic high-risk scenario, a situation that could turn dangerous in an instant. But what happened next defied every one of her expectations. One of the young men, noticing that the strap of her bag had slipped off her shoulder and was about to fall, quickened his pace. He stopped a respectful few feet away and said in a soft, polite voice, "Ma'am, excuse me, your strap." Angela held her breath, watching as he pointed. Before she could react, another of the men stepped forward, smiled apologetically, and said, "Wouldn't want you to lose anything." He didn't touch her or her bag, just gestured with a gentle kindness. The third man simply nodded at her. They passed by without another word, their laughter resuming as they disappeared down the street. It was over in seconds. So simple, so natural, that it left her breathless. There had been no threat, no danger. Only an act of pure, unprompted courtesy from a group of strangers. She sank onto a nearby stone bench, and to her utter astonishment, tears began to stream down her face. They were not tears of fear, but of shame. She had come to this city with the baked-in prejudice of her profession, that human beings behave well only when they are watched. And here, on a dark, unmonitored night, she had been shown the most sincere kindness. She fumbled for her recorder, her voice trembling as she spoke into it. People don't need to be watched to be good. The next morning, as the soft Savannah sun filtered through the leaves of the oak trees, Angela sat by her window, watching the city come to life. She thought of the night before, and for the first time since arriving, she smiled. It was a small, fragile smile, the kind that belongs to someone who has just shed a great weight and discovered a new, liberating truth. Savannah, the city she had once dismissed as a chaotic anomaly, was now her teacher. And she was beginning to learn that its most profound lessons were not about security, but about trust and the quiet, resilient goodness of humanity. She didn't know it yet, but at that moment, the entire trajectory of her research had shifted away from data and toward the human soul. After that night of confronting her own fear, Angela Mueller awoke feeling transformed. The urge to chase statistics and plot charts had vanished, replaced by a deep curiosity about the people themselves, the invisible, emotional data that no camera or sensor could ever record. She reached out to a sociology professor at the Savannah College of Art and Design, a man named Dr. Williams who had written extensively on the cultural fabric of the American South. He was a calm, thoughtful man with a gentle smile and eyes that seemed to hold a deep reservoir of compassion. When they first met in his book-cluttered office, Angela launched into an explanation of her research goals, her words still tinged with the precise language of her academic background. Professor Williams simply listened, then smiled. "If you want to understand why Savannah is safe, Angela," he said, his voice a soft baritone, "you must first forget every theory you have in your head." The next day, he took her not to a data center or a police precinct, but to a Sunday potluck at a community church near a historic market. Amidst the cheerful chaos of the crowd, Angela observed how people moved with an unspoken rhythm, a choreography that required no director. Children, adults, and the elderly all mingled with an invisible deference, a shared understanding of personal space and mutual respect. "Down here," Professor Williams explained as they filled their plates with fried chicken and potato salad, "there's this idea of not wanting to be a bother. We say, 'Bless your heart,' and sometimes it's sharp, sure. But most of the time, it's just a recognition of another person's struggle. It's a kind of self-restraint born from empathy for those around you." The concept of not wanting to be a bother resonated deeply within her. In Europe, safety was built by laws and enforced by authority. But in Savannah, it seemed to be woven from the threads of common decency and human consideration. He led her to a quiet courtyard behind the church, where a few volunteers were calmly sweeping fallen leaves. A young woman offered Angela a glass of sweet tea and said quietly, "When folks' hearts are calm, the community is calm. Fear comes from an unsettled heart." Angela sat in silence, the warm glass in her hand. The woman's simple words were like a gentle breeze that blew through the rigid walls of her rational mind, opening a door to a new way of thinking. She began to understand. Perhaps safety didn't come from being watched, but from the feeling of being seen, of being recognized as a fellow human being who deserved respect and trust. From that day on, her note-taking changed. She stopped recording numbers and started collecting stories. A cab driver told her he often gave free rides to people who were down on their luck because you never know when you'll be the one needing a hand up. A vendor at the market explained that if a regular customer forgot their wallet, he'd let them take their groceries and pay him back later. "I know they're good for it," he'd said with a shrug. These small, seemingly insignificant anecdotes began to form a mosaic of a society built on a foundation of implicit trust. Angela realized that the kindness she was witnessing wasn't a series of isolated acts. It was a cultural habit, passed down through generations. That evening, sitting in a small coffee shop, she wrote her emerging conclusion: no surveillance system can substitute for common decency. The safety of Savannah is hidden in the million tiny, considerate actions its people perform every day. She remembered the young men in the square, the help she received before she even knew she needed it. She was finally starting to understand. She no longer wanted to argue with data. She wanted to learn by listening, by observing, by understanding the human heart. A week later, Angela arranged an interview at the local police department. A friendly, soft-spoken captain told her, "We hardly ever have to intervene in minor disputes. Folks around here usually sort things out peacefully themselves. We only step in when it's truly necessary." He added with a smile, "We don't rely much on high-tech gadgets. We find it's enough to just let the community take care of itself." As she left the station, a light rain began to fall, casting a silvery sheen on the cobblestone streets. Angela stood under an awning, watching the slow, deliberate dance of traffic. A car would stop to let a bicyclist pass. A pedestrian would wave a thank you. There was no resentment, no impatience. A genuine smile formed on her lips, the smile of someone who finally, truly understood. The most valuable lessons she had learned here had not come from any textbook, but from the people themselves and the simple, profound way they chose to live for one another. 2 months later, Angela Mueller returned to Hamburg. She was greeted by a familiar chill in the air and a sky the color of slate. Stepping out of the airport, she felt as though she had returned from another world, one that was both intimately familiar and strangely distant. Her suitcase was filled not just with documents, data, and research notes, but with stories of human decency, of smiles and knowing glances that no camera could ever capture. A few days later, she was invited to give a lecture at the Institute for Environmental Studies, the same place where she had been lauded as a top expert on high-tech urban security. The lecture hall was filled with old colleagues, all expecting a detailed report on the efficiency of Asian-style control systems, having misunderstood the focus of her American research. But Angela's opening statement sent a ripple of shock through the room. "Savannah is a safe city," she began, her voice calm and clear, not because of its surveillance, but because of its humanity. On the large screen behind her, she displayed not graphs or charts, but simple photographs she had taken with her phone. A neighbor helping an intoxicated man find his doorstep, a driver stopping mid-block to let a family with a stroller cross the street, a market vendor sharing a laugh with a competitor. There were no complex statistics, only ordinary everyday moments. A young professor, one of her former students, stood up to object. "That is merely anecdotal, Dr. Mueller. Do you have any quantifiable evidence to support these sentimental observations?" Angela smiled faintly and answered with a quiet confidence that unnerved them. "No," she said. "I don't. But sometimes the most important things cannot be measured." Her answer prompted murmurs of disbelief from some, dismissive shakes of the head from others. But a few listened in thoughtful silence. "We are accustomed to building high walls, installing cameras, and instilling a sense of fear to maintain order," she continued. "But in Savannah, I saw the opposite. People maintain order by respecting one another, by not wanting to be a bother, by not wanting to cause another person to lose face. And that, I've learned, is the very foundation of safety." She showed a final image, a photo of the church courtyard at dusk, people quietly lining up to donate food and blankets to the homeless. There were no police, no laws compelling them, yet there was no pushing, no chaos. "This," she said, "is discipline born from trust." When the lecture ended, the hall remained eerily silent. Professor Weber, the man who had been her doctoral advisor, approached her. "Angela," he said, his voice laced with concern, "you are straying from the path of science." She looked at her old mentor, her smile warm and unwavering. "Perhaps," she replied gently, "some sciences need to take a step back to hear the sound of the human voice." Her answer left him speechless. That evening, a local newspaper published an interview with her under the headline, "German Researcher Challenges Western Theories of Urban Security." The article went viral, igniting a fierce debate. Some accused her of romanticizing the American South, while others hailed her as a pioneer of new thought. But regardless of the opinion, no one could deny that her words had forced everyone to reconsider the very meaning of safety. A week later, she was invited onto an international television program. The host asked, "Do you believe the Savannah model can be applied to European cities?" She shook her head. "No, because it is not a model. It is a consciousness. And consciousness cannot be installed. It must be cultivated." The statement silenced the entire studio. That night, back in her small, quiet apartment, Angela looked out her window at the cold, orderly streets of Hamburg. The reflection of her warm, yellow lamp on the glass reminded her of the glow from the Savannah diners, the smell of pecan pie, and the endless kindness in strangers' eyes. A wave of longing washed over her, not for the place itself, but for the feeling of being trusted among strangers. She knew she could never go back to the academic she once was. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would one day return to Savannah, the city that had taught her that true security isn't found within walls of steel and concrete, but within the open and trusting heart of a community. 3 months after the lecture that sent ripples through Hamburg's academic circles, Angela Mueller was back in Savannah. The plane landed in the bright afternoon sun, and the city felt just as vibrant and alive as it had on her first visit. This time, however, she carried no questionnaires, no data recorders. She had come not as a researcher cataloging a subject, but as a person on a pilgrimage, seeking to reconnect with a feeling that science had taught her to forget. As she stepped out of the terminal, the same cab driver from her first visit recognized her instantly. He waved, a broad, sunny grin spreading across his face. "Miss Angela," he called out. "Welcome back. It's been a while." She replied in the rudimentary but heartfelt Mandarin she'd picked up from Taiwanese friends, a language of the heart she now preferred. "Ni hao, ni hao." Just two simple words, but they filled her with an incredible warmth. She rented the same small apartment in the historic district, the very room where her journey of discovery had begun. That evening, Angela walked alone along the banks of the Savannah River. A gentle breeze rustled the palmettos, and the lights from the grand buildings on the bluff shimmered on the water's surface like scattered fragments of memory. She saw the same familiar sights, the street vendors selling pralines, the laughing young people on bicycles, the child helping an elderly woman navigate the uneven cobblestones. Everything was as it had been. The only thing that had changed was her. In a new, clean notebook, she wrote, "I came here to prove my theory was correct. Instead, Savannah proved to me that my theory needed a soul to be complete." The next morning, she made her way to the community church she had visited with Professor Williams. The faint sound of the organ drifted through the open doors. She sat quietly on a wooden pew, letting the peaceful atmosphere wash over her. An elderly volunteer, recognizing her from before, approached with a gentle smile. "Have you found what you were looking for, dear?" she asked. Angela bowed her head slightly. "I think so," she replied softly. "I found peace within myself." The woman simply nodded, leaving her to her thoughts. In that moment, Angela understood that safety wasn't the absence of danger, but the presence of mutual trust and the mastery of one's own inner fears. That afternoon, she visited Professor Williams at the college. He greeted her with a cup of warm herbal tea and a knowing smile. "Ready to write your new model?" he asked. Angela laughed gently. "Not a model," she answered. "A story." She told him about her plans for a new book, tentatively titled The Human City, the story of a scholar's journey from believing in data to believing in trust. Professor Williams beamed. "Excellent," he said. "You've finally understood what we mean by a peaceful heart." That night, Angela stood on a pedestrian bridge overlooking the bustling streets. The sound of car horns, street musicians, and distant laughter all blended into a single, vibrant symphony. A woman she didn't know, passing by, met her eyes and offered a small smile and a nod. Angela nodded back, feeling a profound sense of belonging, of being an integral part of the city's living fabric. She knew then that her journey wasn't over. It was a lifelong pilgrimage to understand humanity not with theories, but with an open heart. Late that night, in her small apartment, she wrote the final entry in her notebook. "Safety is not a product of technology. It is the result of trust. A city only becomes truly safe when its people learn to treat one another with kindness." She set down her pen, closed the notebook, and looked out the window at the still glowing lights of Savannah. A sleepless city, alive with unspoken connections. A faint, peaceful smile touched Angela's lips as she whispered into the warm, humid air. "Thank you, Savannah. Thank you for teaching me how to trust the world again."